Today, we're diving into 3 real-life stories where ordinary choice destiny, seemingly harmless decisions, ended up rewriting history for millions of people. These aren't stories of fate or coincidence. They're stories where someone made a simple call, and the ripple effects were seismic. Let's begin with a man named Gary. It was the 17th of January, 1977, just before sunrise. The winter air in Draper, Utah was sharp and still as a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore stepped toward the entrance of an old, abandoned canned food factory. His hands were restrained, his arms flanked by guards. But make no mistake, Gary wasn't resisting. He wasn't panicked. In fact, he'd been waiting for this day, eager, even. He walked calmly, deliberately, as the guards led him into the enormous, vacant building. Inside, the space yawned open like a warehouse. It was completely empty except for one lone wooden chair stationed at the very back wall, no lights, no equipment. Just concrete, silence, and that chair. Gary knew exactly what to do. Without being prompted, he walked to the chair, sat down, and stared straight ahead. The guards tightened straps around his wrists and ankles. He didn't flinch. He didn't plead. His gaze was locked on a massive curtain that hung across from him on the other side of the room. The curtain looked out of place, like it had been wheeled in just for the occasion. It had 5 evenly spaced holes cut into it. And behind each hole, Gary knew, was a rifle, and behind each rifle, a man. A member of the firing squad. The execution Gary himself had requested. Gary Gilmore was a convicted murderer. Months earlier, he'd been sentenced to death. The decision had made national headlines. And after the sentence, Gary's mother and the American Civil Liberties Union tried everything to overturn it to get it commuted to life in prison. But Gary fought back. He wanted to die. In fact, he insisted on it. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life in a cell. So instead, he asked for the death penalty. Not only Faith asked for it to be carried out by firing squad. And now, here he was, waiting, silent. The chaplain stepped forward and read Gary his last rites. Then he asked gently if Gary had any final words. Gary looked up at him, eyes unwavering, and said simply, "Let's do it." The chaplain stepped away. The 5 rifles slid forward through the curtain cutouts. A signal was given. Then bang! Gary Gilmore was dead. And that would have been the end of it. But 10 years later, in 1987, his final words would reappear in a place no one expected. 1,000 miles away, in Portland, Oregon, a man named Dan Whedon was in the middle of a frustrating meeting. Dan owned a small but rising advertising agency, and he'd just taken on a new client, a small shoe company with big ambitions. The company was promising, but Dan could tell they were missing something. A message, an identity, a slogan. For hours, Dan and his team brainstormed. They pitched bold ideas, emotional concepts, weird one-liners. Nothing clicked. Everything felt just okay. Dan was deflated. And then, out of nowhere, he remembered Gary Gilmore. He remembered the story, the abandoned factory, the curtain, the rifles, the final words, "Let's do it." Something about that line stuck in his head. It was powerful, urgent, short, but Dan knew it was too dark to use as is, so he made one tiny tweak. He changed "Let's do it" to "Just do it." That phrase would become the tagline for the small shoe company Dan had taken on. The company was Nike, and "Just do it" would become one of the most iconic slogans of all time. A slogan born from a killer's final breath. But our next story starts in a very different place. It's 2009 in London. A 23-year-old guy named Chris is wrapping up a casual date night. He doesn't have much money, so dinner is McDonald's. It's not fancy. In fact, it's grimy, loud, and packed. But Chris and his date are trying to make the best of it. He's got a big job interview in the morning, and tonight is about simple connection, sharing some food and hoping she understands his situation. They wait in line, order, grab their tray, and then realize there's nowhere to sit. Every table is full. They wander a bit, eyes scanning, until they spot a nearly empty table with just one guy eating alone. He's quiet, not bothering anyone, and there are 2 free seats. Chris asks politely, "Mind if we join you?" Just for a quick bite. Oh. The guy looks up, shrugs. Sure. They sit, start eating. For a moment it's fine. But Chris's mind is elsewhere. Tomorrow's interview. It's all he can think about. He's barely touching his food, and his date keeps the conversation going while he zones out. But something strange begins to tug at the edge of his awareness. He notices the guy across from them isn't eating anymore. He's just staring at Chris's date. And not in a neutral way. Not like someone who's daydreaming. No, this guy's gaze is intense, invasive, like he's sizing her up. Chris glances at his date. She's pretending not to notice, but her body's stiff. Then, without warning, the guy starts speaking. He starts insulting her, out loud, right in front of both of them. He mocks her voice, her looks, calls her names. Chris snaps out of his anxiety. What did you say? The guy turns to Chris and sneers. She's an ugly pig. Now Chris had never been in a fight before, ever. But something inside him boiled. He couldn't just sit there. He stood up and told the guy, "Get up." But the moment the guy stood up, Chris realized he'd made a huge mistake. This man was massive, taller, heavier, stronger. Before Chris could even react, the guy lunged and beat him to the ground right there in the middle of McDonald's. Fists flew, people screamed, no one helped. Eventually, the man just walked away, disappearing into the night. Bruised and humiliated, Chris got up and apologized to his date. She was shaken but understanding. They parted ways. And the next morning, Chris looked in the mirror and saw a giant black eye staring back. The job interview was in a few hours. He almost didn't go. But something told him, just do it. He pulled himself together, put on a clean shirt, and headed to the meeting, his eyes swollen, face bruised. The interviewers definitely noticed. They didn't ask about it, but they noticed. And Chris could feel it in the room. Their glances, their silence, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who the hell did this guy get in a fight with? But Chris powered through. He did his best. He walked out thinking he'd blown it. Until he got the call. He'd landed the job. And not just any job. He'd landed the role. Because that interview? It was an audition for a television character who gets into fights. And Chris had walked in looking like the character. The show? Game of Thrones. And Chris? You know him better as Kit Harington, the man who played Jon Snow. The morning light filtering through the blinds didn't make things easier for Chris. He stood in the mirror, staring at his own reflection. A deep, purplish black eye had bloomed overnight, swelling around the socket like a badge of humiliation. The date had ended in disaster. The guy who'd assaulted him in McDonald's had vanished, leaving Chris with a battered face, wounded pride, and absolutely no closure. And now, in a few hours, he had a job interview. Not just any interview, the kind that could change everything. But who was going to take a guy seriously when he looked like he'd just gotten into a bar brawl? He pressed a cold towel against the bruise, wincing. For a moment he considered canceling. But then something inside him hardened. This interview was his only show, couldn't afford to miss it. So, suit on, best shoes polished, and heart pounding, Chris headed out into the London morning with a bruised face and everything to lose. The building where the interview was held looked like it belonged to someone else's life, modern, sleek, the kind of place where real success happened. Chris took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and stepped inside. Inside, the lobby buzzed with energy. Professionals milled about, dressed to the nines, everyone looking far more put together than he felt. He checked in at the front desk, where the receptionist did a double take at his face but said nothing. The silence was worse than a comment. Minutes later, Chris was led into a conference room. 3 people were waiting for him, 2 men and 1 woman, all looking him over curiously. Again, no one mentioned the bruise. The interview started with routine questions. Chris answered the best he could, trying to ignore how self-conscious he felt. But something strange began to happen. As the interviewers asked him questions, they leaned in. They watched him more closely. Their eyes lit up when he spoke, like something was clicking into place. And when it was all over, they thanked him, shook his hand, and sent him on his way. Chris left the building not knowing what to make of any of it. He had no idea what they thought of him or the black eye. He chalked it up as another failure in a string of bad breaks. But then, just 2 days later, he got a phone call. He got the job. But not just any job. You see, this wasn't your ordinary interview. Chris had auditioned without realizing it for a lead role in a new television series. The character was rough around the edges, the kind of guy who looked like he'd been through something. And Chris, with his natural charisma and real-life black eye, looked like he'd walked straight out of the script. They didn't just hire him, they cast him as the lead. And the show? It exploded. Over the next few years, that battered kid from McDonald's became a global sensation. The boy who could barely afford fast food dinners was now sitting front row at award shows, dressed in designer suits, nominated for Emmys and Golden Globes. He wasn't just successful, he was iconic. That young man, Chris, the world knows him as Kit Harington. And that role he accidentally auditioned for with a black eye? Jon Snow, the brooding, battle-scarred hero of Game of Thrones. A generation earlier, in a quiet dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, another young man was preparing to celebrate. It was 1925, and the United States was deep in Prohibition. That meant alcohol was illegal even for students over the age of 21. But Ted, a bright, ambitious senior, didn't care. Tonight was a night for celebration. He had just been named editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, the Jack-O-Lantern, a prestigious student publication. For a kid with dreams of becoming a professional writer, it felt like the first step toward something big. So he invited some friends over, pulled out a bottle of gin, and they toasted to the future. Laughter echoed through the dorm room. Ted took a long drink from the bottle and passed it around. He wasn't worried. Everything was going exactly according to plan, until there was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. Ted hesitated for a moment, then walked over and opened it. 2 police officers stood there, stern and silent. Busted. It was over in seconds. They were all caught with the gin. Ted's dreams didn't end that night, but they took a major hit. While no one went to jail, Dartmouth did not go easy on him. They stripped him of his academic honors and, most devastating of all, removed him from his role as editor-in-chief. And not just that, they banned him from publishing anything in the Jack-O-Lantern. Completely. Even anonymous submissions were off-limits. The door to his future had slammed shut. But Ted was stubborn and clever. He thought, if I can't write as myself, then I'll write as someone else. And so, using a pen name no one had ever heard before, Ted began secretly submitting work to the magazine he'd once run. His writing was so good, the new editors had no idea it was him. They loved the submissions, published every single one, and something strange happened. Ted realized he liked writing under this mysterious name. It gave him freedom, a little mischief. He leaned into it. Even after he graduated, he kept using it. That pen name? It stuck with him. And under that name, he wrote and illustrated over 60 book stories that would go on to shape childhoods for generations, that would entertain and inspire millions around the world. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. And to think, it all started because of one bad decision in a dorm room. The name he chose that night? Dr. Seuss. Let's rewind a bit. Think about it. A death row inmate says, "Let's do it." And a decade later, those 3 words become the rallying cry for one of the most iconic brands in the world. A guy gets beat up in a McDonald's and shows up to an interview looking like hell, and that black eye becomes the accidental costume for one of the most legendary television characters ever written. A college student gets banned from writing, and out of spite, he creates a fake identity that becomes one of the most beloved names in children's literature. And these aren't fairy tales. These aren't fables. These are real people. Their lives and ours changed forever because of a tiny choice, a single moment that seemed meaningless at the time. But it's not always that dramatic. Sometimes the moment doesn't look like a firing squad or a black eye or a prohibition bust. Sometimes it looks like a coffee shop. Let me explain. It's 1994. Seattle, Washington. A 27-year-old woman named Joanne is sitting in a Starbucks. She's hunched over a notebook, scribbling madly. The steam from her drink curls up past her eyes, but she barely notices. She's been coming here every day for weeks. Why? Because her apartment is freezing. The heat got shut off. Again. She's a single mom, broke, and barely scraping by. Her daughter is still young, and Joanne is doing everything she can to keep her safe, fed, and warm. The coffee shop is the only place she can find reliable heat and a quiet corner to write. And that's what she's been doing. Writing. But not just journaling or essays. Joanne is building a world, one made of castles and magic and secret trains. A world where a small, lonely boy finds out he's actually the most important person in an entirely hidden universe. Joanne knows she's taking a risk. She has no publishing deal, no agent, no money. Just an idea and a lot of rejection letters. So many, in fact, that by the time she finishes her first manuscript, she's already been turned down a dozen times. People say it's too long, too weird. That no kid is going to want to read a book that's nearly 80,000 words long about some made-up wizard school. But she keeps going. She revises the book at night after putting her daughter to bed, submits it again and again, and finally, someone says yes. The book is published in 1997. It gets a small run, just 500 copies. Half of them go to libraries. The other half? They sell out in hours. Because the book is magic. And the boy she created, the orphan with the lightning scar, becomes the most recognizable fictional character in the world. That struggling single mother in a Starbucks? You know her now as J.K. Rowling. And the book? Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It became a billion-dollar franchise. The fastest-selling book series in human history. 8 films, a theme park, generations of fans. But more than that, it gave hope. To kids who didn't fit in. To readers who felt invisible. To writers who thought they'd never make it. All because Joanne Rowling refused to stop writing in a coffee shop when her heat got turned off. These stories are extreme, sure. But they aren't about fame. They're about friction. Moments when the world pushed back. When the odds said no. And instead of folding, these people leaned in. Gary Gilmore's last words weren't profound philosophy. They were surrender. But they echoed. And that echo turned into a mantra that drove generations to run, to build, to fight for more. Kit Harington could have skipped that audition, hidden his face, waited for the swelling to go down. But instead, he showed up looking like a man who'd survived something because he had. Dr. Seuss could have let that setback crush him. Instead, he created an alias and built an empire from rejection. J.K. Rowling could have said, "I'll write later when life calms down." But instead, she kept going, even when the world kept saying no. And here's the thing, every single one of these people, they had no idea what they were doing at the time would matter. They weren't trying to be icons. They weren't trying to be inspirational. They were just surviving, showing up, writing one more page, taking one more risk. You might not be sitting in a Starbucks, or wearing a black eye, or staring down a curtain with 5 rifles pointed at your heart. But maybe you're at a crossroads. Maybe you've been told no, or laughed at, or ignored. Maybe you've started something and failed, or never started at all, because the idea seemed too big or you felt too small. But what if the thing you do next, the tiny thing, the ordinary thing, is the one that echoes? What if that awkward date night, or that embarrassing setback, or that weird line in your notebook is the beginning? You won't know until later, years later, when someone else connects the dots and tells your story, and maybe they'll say, "This all started because one person decided not to quit." So whatever you're facing today, whatever resistance, rejection, or randomness you're staring down, just do it.